Good afternoon. Welcome to Preservation Connecticut Spring 2023 series talking about preservation. Our noontime chats about everything preservation. I'm Jane Montanaro, Executive Director of Preservation Connecticut, and I'm pleased to be your host. Today, we have the privilege of welcoming Dr. Leah Glaser, Professor of History at Central Connecticut State University, to discuss her book, Interpreting Energy at Museums and Historic Sites. But before I hand the controls over to Leah, I would like to give you a quick overview of Preservation Connecticut. Preservation Connecticut is the statewide, private nonprofit historic preservation organization founded in 1975 by a special act of the Connecticut General Assembly as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation to preserve, protect, and promote the buildings, sites, and landscapes that contribute to the heritage and vitality of Connecticut's communities. We are statutory partners with the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office, and I'm proud to say that for over 4 decades, we have successfully championed the protection of remarkable community assets all over the state by leveraging funding, advocating, forming partnerships, and promoting stewardship. Our office is on Whitney Avenue in Hamden, Connecticut, and it's listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Shown here, it's the Eli Whitney boarding house built in 1827 to house workers for Eli Whitney's factory, and it served as Preservation Connecticut's headquarters since 1989. We have a staff of 9 preservation professionals and a board of 21 preservationists from around the state. Staff listed here are always available to assist with inquiries. Christopher Wiegren is our Deputy Director. Contact Chris for information on historic preservation easements, our bi-monthly magazine, Connecticut Preservation News, our Olmsted in Connecticut Landscape Survey Project, or to arrange book talks for his book, Connecticut Architecture, Stories of 100 Places. Renee Tribert, Making Places and Preservation Services Manager. Please contact Renee for information on redevelopment of historic industrial sites and tax credit applications. Jordan Sorensen is our Development and Special Projects Manager. Jordan manages our communications and outreach to members through social media and email, receives and monitors demolition notices from municipalities, and prepares historic tax credit applications and nominations to the State and National Register of Historic Places. Kristen Hopewood, our development assistant, manages all of the inquiries that come through our website, provides member services, arranges special events, and is the editor of our Historic Properties Exchange, a free listing of threatened historic properties. And finally, our team of circuit riders, Brad Scheid, Mike Farino, Stacy Vero, and Stefan Danchuk, provide immediate boots on the ground service to homeowners, developers, municipal leaders, nonprofit organizations and museums, historic district commissions, and more, with an array of preservation technical assistance, including community organizing, prioritizing maintenance and repairs, historic designation, funding, and archaeology. These chats have become an enjoyable and informative way to connect with our members and the public and hear what's on your mind. Please feel free to use the chat feature and to ask questions, or ask questions directly at the end of the presentation, and certainly contact us afterwards for a call or a site visit. A sneak peek at next week, on May 3rd, we'll be talking about funding for rural resources with Jennifer Lurch of the United States Department of Agriculture. And as always, please feel free to let us know about topics that interest you. We would like to hear from you. And with that, Leah, I can hand the controls over to you and you can share your screen.
Okay. Okay, can everybody see this?
Yes.
Okay,
Perfect.
all right, let me get other things off my screen. Okay, hi everybody. Thank you, Jane. Thank you, Stacy, for inviting me for another one of these talks. I'm excited to talk about this new book, Interpreting Energy at Museums and Historic Sites. I am a professor of history at Central Connecticut State University, for those of you who don't know me, and there I coordinate the public history program. Specifically, I teach courses in public history and historic preservation, and I serve on the State Historic Preservation Council. I'll talk about kind of why I got into this particular topic. I do want to point out that this is part of a series, which is why it has sort of an interesting format for the title, and I'll talk about how I came to this topic in a moment. Let's see, click. Oops, that's not clicking. Nope. Oh, yeah, so here you go. So I realized that you can't see what I click on, but it's part of the Roman Littlefield Interpreting History series is what happened when I clicked on that. So why interpret energy? That was certainly a question that a lot of people have. I've been thinking about this topic for a very long time, but a lot of people don't really see have a hard time making the connection. A lot of people in the area of cultural resources certainly understand climate change, and certainly we understand how preservation is a sustainable choice. But in terms of interpreting it, sometimes it's somewhat unclear. Sorry, I just lost my mouse. But basically, you know, we know that a lot has been happening in the world in terms of climate change, and it's only getting more urgent. And while we might think that as a small profession, a small cluster of historians and cultural resource managers and historic site managers and museum people, you know, we are not going to make the biggest impact. This really is an all hands on deck moment. And we know that, you know, even though the sirens have been wailing since at least the mid-'80s about climate change, not much has been done. We still never veered off course. And at this point, all we can do is diminish the impacts. And so we as cultural resource managers and historians and preservationists and humanities people, we understand how to communicate. And so I feel like there is a place for us. I was also inspired because I watched Greta Thunberg's documentary during the pandemic, over the pandemic. And one of the things she said in there, and she was later interviewed about it by the BBC, is one of the things that she stresses is we cannot overestimate the power of storytelling when it comes to changing people's minds about climate change. And that obviously rung very loudly in my ears, and it seems a very resonant thing and something within our wheelhouse as historic preservationists, historians, and storytellers. And then I remembered, of course, this you know, quote, although obvious, but really impactful, from historian David Nye, whose work I've been inspired by since the 90s. Our high energy lifestyle is a confluence of cultural choices. This was a statement that actually inspired my dissertation when I was writing on it, to really understand that we can't just talk about the science, we can't just talk about the economics, we really need to talk about behavior and what's motivating our behavior, which is culture and cultural values. So that was the statement that inspired my dissertation. And just so you can see, on the left is my book, Electrifying the Rural American West. So next week's talk is kind of interesting to me in terms of rural development. And that was about the delivery of electricity to various communities in Arizona, and how rural electrification reflects not just the economics, but also the geography and the culture of the different communities it serves. The reason I got into that is I worked for years for the Salt River Project, which is the utility company for the Salt River Valley of central Arizona. And I worked on water and power issues in their historical archives as my graduate internship. I was doing that because I was writing about a local community whose labor force was a primary labor force for the Salt River Project. But then obviously when you're interning, you get pulled into different areas. And with that community and the other work I was doing, these questions about environmental justice and who gets to take advantage of energy started becoming really interesting questions for me. So increasingly, I became more and more interested in environmental history. And that's something that I'd been reading stuff about. You can see Martin Molosi and Phil Scarpino's book back in the 90s. But then in 2014, I was the program, I helped design the program for the National Council on Public History annual conference in Monterey, California. The theme coincided with my then sabbatical project, which was to explore public history and sustainability. And out of that came a digital publication. You see that somebody else was in charge of, and then I edited the public historian on that topic to try to get people to start thinking about, or thinking again about the relationship between public history and environmental sustainability and what we as historians can do as this climate crisis just becomes worse and worse. So energy and public history, what are the connections? Historically, it's really interesting to me because the modern environmental movement, which really gets going in the 1970s, kind of coincides with the public history as a profession. It actually coincides in the early part too, depending on whose kind of timeline you read about the public history profession. But the first public historians were for the National Park Service, and they were very much involved in natural resources as well as cultural resources. And then in the 1970s, when public history goes into universities and people start training in it, that's exactly the time when the environmental movement is also pushing environmental history into universities. So it kind of makes sense. So we have increasing popularity of environmental history through the 90s and the early and the 2000s and even today. And then there's this. We know that the UN's definition of sustainability, at least those who follow climate change, the formal definition of sustainability is to fulfill the needs of current generations without compromising the needs of future generations. And ensuring, this was added recently, and ensuring a balance between economic growth, environmental care, and social well-being. So you have those three parts. You have this idea of thinking about future generations. And we know that's kind of also our mission as preservationists, is to ensure that the resources of the past are also there for the future generations. So we're stewards of those resources. And so it's a very similar mission. I see it as very much in line with one another. And then, of course, historic sites offer place-based context and technologies and strategies in a way that, you know, hearing about the science of climate change or the use of energy or the statistics are not going to maybe resonate with the average person as much as actually being there and being able to witness how things work. And it is informative for us to not just be told about future energy, but to understand that a lot of what we think about as new energy choices were actually old energy choices. And we very deliberately made a choice to go with fossil fuels. So energy has always been place-based until it's not, and that's part of the problem. When we stopped using the energy in the place that we were at and started delivering the energy and transporting the energy, it increasingly, fossil fuels increasingly became the, with advances in transportation, fossil fuels became the easiest and answer. for all of that. Okay. I'm so sorry. I am. Oh, there we go. Whoops. Sorry, I lost my. Okay. There we go. All right. So my book, Interpreting Energy, focuses on several themes throughout the chapters in terms of understanding kind of how to talk about this historically. One is just understanding how energy's been generated and developed over time, how people have used energy both in the industrial sphere and domestically, the economic aspects of energy development, but also the importance of energy to national security, whether that means militarily or that just means economically. Who has access to energy and the equity issues associated with that. And then stressing these ideas about energy transition and energy diversity as a way to step back on our dependence on fossil fuels and understand that we don't have to just make one choice, and that there's always been energy transitions over time, and there's always been introduction of new energy sources over time. And so transitioning might not, or diversifying might not be so hard and scary as we think. Museums and preservationists obviously have been talking about climate change for a while. This is a picture of Sarah Sutton, who's kind of the leader of this idea of the sustainable museum. She has a book in this series as well that talks about how museums can actually become sustainable as institutions. So I do recommend that. And she also has started a nonprofit group called Culture Over Carbon. I also recommend just Googling that and seeing that organization, as she talks about ways that museums can, sorry, I spelled museum wrong there, that museums can contribute to the solution here. And then, of course, the National Trust has been promoting the ideas of culture over carbon, of the greenest building. We see this older report about quantifying environmental value of building reuse. One should look, this is a great slogan, the greenest building, but we also need to be mindful that it also depends on various circumstances in terms of how much embodied energy an older building will have, and what circumstances are best, work best in terms of restoring that place. We do know that demolition, though, and new construction is one of the worst contributors of carbon, of the carbon footprint. And I just wanted to highlight my hosts here that Preservation Connecticut's been talking about it for several years. There's an issue here that I couldn't grab. I think it's too old, but it's the one with the solar panels on the building. So I just wanted to highlight that there's lots of other resources if you're interested in all kinds of aspects in terms of climate change and preservation and public history. So this gets us to museums and historic sites. So not every museum and historic site can necessarily have an equally compelling story about energy as each other, but a lot of historic sites can if we kind of think broadly, and obviously some more than others. And so understanding that energy is not that different from a lot of the other stuff that we do as historians in terms of working with material culture, whether it's buildings or whether it's these actual energy pieces that you see here at the Beckley furnace. What you're seeing here is slag, which is kind of waste product from an iron furnace. And then on the other side here, you see limestone and iron ore and charcoal, which are the other pieces that are needed as part of energy. And they are the material culture that become energy. I think we tend to think of energy as something that we can't touch, but we can actually, we can often touch it. We certainly can see it. We certainly can smell it. We can use our other senses. And so when we analyze material culture, by going through, these different steps in terms of genesis, where it comes from, we can do all of this with energy as well. How is energy constructed? What is the source of this piece? How is it constructed? How is it made? How is it developed? What is its purpose? And how do we interpret that in terms of what it really means to how people behave, people's values, the impact on a historical event or trends or lifestyles. So, a lot of museums around Connecticut have actual artifacts that talk that can talk in interesting ways about energy. It doesn't have to be one of the forms that you normally think of, because humans put out energy. Humans eat food. Food is energy. So any kind of food history, but also muscle energy. Going back to the whole agricultural kind of history. This is this piece in the Sloan Museum in Kent, Connecticut, and they're for horses too. This one is for a dog, but you put a dog on this little treadmill and it can operate, a plow or operate any machine with this very simple, belts and wheels and things like that. And you're using the muscle energy of a dog or a horse. And so this was kind of very popular for especially threshing machines. If you go on YouTube and you Google horse-powered threshing machines, it's kind of funny. People have done demonstrations of this, but that shows a type of muscle energy. And obviously any kind of human labor, including that of enslaved peoples, is human energy and muscle energy. And so that kind of counts when we're talking about this, because what we've done with these other forms of energy is just substitute that muscle energy. And those other forms. And so here's just a Sears and Roebuck that they have also at the Sloan Museum, but you'll see that advertisements in catalogs are really great ways to access some of this energy history. So I organized this book by energy type, and I certainly was not completely comprehensive, but I did it this way because I think a lot of people are intimidated by the idea of energy. And I should say that I am in no way a scientist. I got kind of less afraid by working for the utility of technology and science, and the importance of us historians really at least trying to understand the environmental and the science on a very basic level so that we can communicate it. But my first chapter, so I'm going to go through basically my different chapter themes and some of the different examples that I provide as quickly as possible, so you can ask questions at the end. But the first one is wood, because wood was one of the earliest ways that we started using natural resources and burning natural resources to use the energy of the forest. And of course, iron furnaces are a great example of that. And in Connecticut, in Pennsylvania, this is where most of the iron furnaces were. So we have a lot of access to those types of sites. This is actually Massachusetts, the Saugus iron furnace. This is one way that they try to interpret it at Saugus. They've completely reconstructed that furnace. A lot of other furnace sites, we still have at least some of the remains, but they have the reconstructed furnace, and they also have this diorama, which kind of shows people carting charcoal across the bridge. The charcoal would go into the furnace. That's my now 16-year-old son, very excited. He wouldn't be that way now, but looking at how they're putting the charcoal down into the furnace to make it hot enough in order to melt the iron ore and make energy to create the energy to make the iron ore, to make ordnance, to make iron stoves, to make all kinds of tools and implements. Sometimes it's really hard for people to see without some kind of demonstration. It's really tricky, and I'll talk a little bit about more of this, to think about interpreting energy without becoming part of the problem, because the way people, if we did this in real life, you would see a lot of pollution. I'll talk about that in a moment, and we don't want to do that. And a lot of these old iron sites anyway are now in places that are now state parks because they had ravaged the land too badly for agricultural use. And they later became state parks and were given the chance to reclaim the landscape and be more resilient. So a lot of the places that you see these old iron furnaces are now places of environmental recreation. So this one's at Beckley Furnace, but Beckley not only talks about the charcoal energy, but we also have the water power energy. Iron furnaces are all located in these park-like now rural areas because they needed to be near a water source, because they needed the water to run the water wheel, and the water wheel would puff air into the iron furnace, and that would make the fire from the charcoal extremely hot and hot enough. So you needed water energy. And then over here is an old turbine that the water wheel would help turn to generate that heat. And so there's a lot of different pieces of the history here. I wrote an administrative history for the Park Service on the Hopewell Furnace in Pennsylvania, and there they do an annual charcoal burning. Sometimes you can find demonstrations of this. It's obviously a lot of smoke. It's a little bit hard to witness because there's so much pollution, but they're usually in rural areas. It's a craft. It's a technique. My husband's name, and my kid's last name, I kept my name, happens to be Ammerman, which is charcoal maker. So this was a skill that people used to make charcoal, because charcoal burned faster than other types of fuel. So there is ways to demonstrate this, and it is a craft that people are really trying to preserve and figure out ways to convey that skill. So at places like Beckley, you have some interpretation of some of the remaining furnaces. You have similar interpretation at Kent Furnace. And again, they talk about, how the iron furnace works. But for those of us who aren't iron furnace sites, a lot of people can still talk about the products of these iron furnace sites, and then talk about how they were made and the energy used to make them. And so that includes these kinds of stoves. This was an output of a lot of iron furnaces, particularly places like Hopewell. And you can see that they could be incredible pieces of furniture in a home. They didn't have to be this fancy. But not only did the iron furnaces use the energy of coal to cook, but they themselves were made from charcoal, the iron that was the material that actually makes up the stove. And so you have a lot of different sources of energy just embodied in the stove in terms of wood energy, and the wood becoming charcoal, and then the charcoal heating up the food. And so there's a lot of different stages that you can discuss. The next chapter that I do talk about is the idea of water. And in Hamden, where Preservation Connecticut is, and right across the street, and of course your Preservation Connecticut is in one of the boarding houses, is the Eli Whitney Museum, and the Eli Whitney site, which was the first site of water power being used for manufacturing. We know that water power was used all over the state of New England for mills. But in terms of being used for manufacturing products, this was kind of the birthplace of that. So there's a lot that this site can do, and is actually starting to do more of now in order to highlight this really important history in terms of water power. They do have, this interactive kind of playscape that the Water Authority established. Eli Whitney Jr. Created one of the first municipal reservoirs so that he could make the water power a little more powerful. and that the falling water at the Mill River site here was already a powerful waterfall, but the reservoir helped lift it up and create enough of force that it could run the water wheel, that the water wheel could then run the machinery and also run the forge, because he also made tools like in the furnace. So there's a lot of different aspects of energy that one can see here. Kids can kind of understand how water works, but I think there's a lot of opportunity for understanding the power of that waterfall if you go there, to understand why water is indeed power. Lowell Mills up in Massachusetts also obviously is one of those old mills that was powered by water. And the Francis turbine is one of their exhibits that's kind of off the beaten path when you go to Lowell, but it's the whole, I would recommend that people go out of their way to make sure they see the Francis turbine and the kind of technology that helped make Lowell one of the centers for those mills, for the textile industry. It's quite a noise that as they try to interpret and show people exactly how it works. There's not many places that you can do that. In the Southwest, where I first kind of discovered water power, since I left, they did this great thing at what's called Arizona Falls. It's in Scottsdale. They created a whole interpretive center around one of their hydroelectric plants. And so it's an operating hydroelectric plants, but it also interprets the history and the technology of water power. And it's kind of become its own park, and it's on the bike path. And they've done a really great job of bringing the history of energy to people as they're kind of recreating around the canals and outside. Obviously, it's really, really important for people in places like the desert to understand where their energy and electricity come from. And so they've kind of taken the interpretation out to the streets and the bike paths. The cultural power of steam. Steam is what really got me thinking about this book and ways that we interpret energy. You can see on the left here, I have the Durango narrow gauge train, Durango Silverton narrow gauge train in Durango, Colorado. And then on the right is the Sabino steamship at Mystic Seaport here in Connecticut. And they don't have this anymore, but you can see the big collection of coal for their steamship, the Sabino, and you can see the same thing over with Durango. And for both of those in the early, around 2010, when I was going to these sites with my family, it was, troublesome. You go to these places and it's a beautiful day, and there's just smoke belching in everybody's face. And it's a weird disconnect, especially in a time of climate change. And these places, I completely understand the joy of steam trains and steamships. But you can see that when we were listening to the person, and this was way back in 2010, talk about it, as the smoke belched into everybody's face, she was like, oh, and that's just the way it was, and it's the price of, energy and some kind of platitude like that. And how bad things could be, and that it's a good lesson for people that we have cleaner air now. And this was before Trump rolled back the Clean Air Act. But I started thinking there's got to be a better way of interpreting this, where we don't actually have to show people the pollution and show people the environmental damage, and still help them recognize, recognize how this energy is actually being produced and and offer solutions as well. So there's a picture of me at age 11. Just to prove that I totally understand the joy of these different sites and what people get out of them. And the goal was to try to think creatively about what else they could do. And as I was writing this book, both of these places, both of these historical sites came up with some pretty ingenious things, both because they wanted to and both because they needed to. So the main issue with the Sabino, it had actually been renovated and restored and changed lots of times. It is listed on the National Register, but the big thing was the steam engine and preserving that technology. And a lot of people argued that we needed to preserve the technology of steam because it had such an impact. But it became harder and harder for both of these sites to continue to operate these steam engines. It is a skill. It requires all of this coal. It can be somewhat dangerous and expensive. And so eventually what Mystic Seaport has done is they're adding basically a electric motor. Right now, this is a diesel motor until they can kind of get permission for the electric motor, but they've reconfigured and restored and altered the bottom of the boat, the inside of the boat, to kind of add this engine. And they've done the same thing in Durango because the coal started one of the biggest forest fires ever in 2019 there, where they've added these engines and they've kept the original engine in place. So this idea of preservation in place, you're not getting rid of the original technology, but you're not using it all the time as part of your interpretation. And you can use it and do demonstrations sometimes, just like the charcoal making, but it doesn't have to be, 15 times a day whenever you do these tours. And so there's these interesting creative solutions that then can be part of the interpretation in terms of energy transition in different ways to still give people the joy of these rides, but not be contributing further to the problems of the climate. Fossil fuels are obviously a challenge sometimes to determine. One of the biggest petroleum museums is in Midland, Texas. It's an incredible space. There's an enormous amount of material culture associated with petroleum and oil, and that's just one example of their exhibits, but you can find almost anything, including your Tupperware and your plastics, that can be material culture for understanding fossil fuels. I found it pretty interesting that the Petroleum Museum had all these oil rigs outside as kind of an outdoor park. They've painted them in pretty colors, and they even have inside landscape paintings that show the oil rigs on the vast Western landscape as kind of a very aesthetic thing of beauty, which is really interesting because aesthetics is one of the main objections to renewable energies like solar panels and wind energy. And then the popularity of cars and transportation museums. A lot of people these are perfect sites to show people that we didn't have to have the combustion engine, that there were a lot of other inventions and ways and other options for automobiles to run on early on, and the combustion engine just kind of won the market. And so the Owl's Head Transportation Museum had this exhibit called Fads and Failures, which was a great exhibit, except I didn't like the title because it implies that what is a fad is kind of a failure, and that we actually need to go back and look at some of these models if we want to move forward and continue to drive our cars. Nuclear energy gets really wrapped up with energy security. And you can't talk about nuclear energy without talking about one of the most troublesome ways of interpreting in public history, which was back in 1995, interpreting the Enola Gay, the plane that dropped the atomic bomb. And unfortunately, instead of talking about that bomb, what the Smithsonian ended up doing was just putting it alongside other planes and talking about the technology. So there's kind of a lost chance to really understand the roots of nuclear energy and why we are afraid to use it as an alternative resource. The Manhattan Project National Historic Site, one of its most popular sites is the B reactor, which is one of the earliest nuclear power plants. And it hasn't changed much since its time. People can still take tours, but it still is unclear about how safe it is for people. And so I have a critic actually writing about it, but the Park Service is now taking control of this interpretation. And so there's a lot of opportunities to talk about nuclear energy and its roots in that of the atomic bomb. And then, we have, with the decommissioning of 3 Mile Island, we only ever had this little historic sign to talk about nuclear energy and its fate. But now that 3 Mile Island has been decommissioned, there's maybe a lot of opportunities to explore and understand nuclear power as an alternative energy source. And a lot of museums, can talk about nuclear energy, even if they don't have a power plant, because there's Vaseline glass that a lot of people have that actually have radioactive products in them. And they all kind of come from that same chemical reaction and chemical source. So it is still a way to talk about nuclear energy, even if you have some of these goblets in your museum. Barnes Museum is one of the best collections of those. There's a lot of kitsch associated with nuclear energy also. And so probably, one of the most interesting ones is the idea of renewables and stressing energy diversity, to understand that renewables are historical. First of all, they are in line with preservation, because you can see that Preservation Connecticut has solar panels on its roof, because it is not a permanent alteration of the original resource. But we can also learn a lot about renewables because people have always used renewables. Farmers off-grid were not interested in paying the power company to get their electricity for the longest time. The government and rural electrification really stressed getting people on the grid, but a lot of farmers wanted to stay off the grid. And one way to do that was through windmills. And there's a great book by Robert Reiter about the history of wind energy in America, which has a pretty deep history and just has one that's been fairly ignored. And then, even before this, but especially mid-century, there were a lot of efforts to try to harness the sun in terms of energy in some of the modern mid-century architecture. So here's a book by Daniel Barber that can talk about how historic older houses can talk a lot about energy. And then just using houses in general as material culture can really help us talk about energy. I thought, hold on, let me just, so there. So I'll go back to that other slide. So houses themselves are artifacts of energy. Sleeping porches are an opportunity to talk about energy. The idea of a front porch was not just for people to kind of hang out and talk to their neighbors, but it was also to help cool the air that would go into the house from the windows. Older houses, the windows are arranged in just such a way that you can get particularly good airflow through them. The New England Saltbox house was situated, as were a lot of older pre-World War II homes, so that they would get the most sun exposure in the front. And then, of course, the salt box was to resist the winter winds in the back. A lot of places, the housing designs are consistent with the local materials and the local climate, like you see with the Navajo Hogan here and the dog trot house in the south, which allows this kind of opening in the middle that allows breezes to come through. And then you have the porch again to help cool the air. And I was last week at a conference in Georgia where we went to this plantation that really the significance of it, it was the largest Cherokee slave owner in Georgia. But what I thought was really interesting is when she really started talking about the house, that it's still a dog trot design, even though it looks like a plantation house, because the spiral staircase would suck all the hot air up. And then the shallow fireplaces would be able to heat the house in the winter. And she talked a lot about the different ways of heating and cooling in terms of the root cellar that they were able to do, that had nothing to do with necessarily the significance of the site, but she was able to talk about energy. let me just go back to the infrastructure, because then lastly, the infrastructure kind of gives us the idea about who has access to electricity, and the history of all of that, and the history of rural electrification has an incredible amount of resources that include films. The Collinsville Axe Powerhouse in Connecticut, some of these older powerhouses are still around. But in terms of understanding infrastructure, that talks about who uses energy, where it goes, who has to pay for it. The development of the grid, I think, is a really educational thing for people to understand that it was developed based on a multitude of economic and cultural decisions. I throw in the insulators here because so many historic sites, historic houses have those and don't quite know what to do with them, but they're a real opportunity to just use as a piece to open the conversation about infrastructure and energy generation. We show the resiliency of even the most traditional cultures like the Navajo using the sun to get themselves off the grid so that they have more power over their own energy use, and the importance of electricity culturally and traditionally and historically for them as represented in this rug. So these are just like as quickly as I can, just kind of a taste of what's in the book. There is a discount code if you're interested or you want to know more, but I wanted to make sure that I stopped in time to answer any questions because I've been talking for a while.
That's great, Leah. Thank you so much. See, Channing Harris has something in the chat. Let's see.
My family ran a company for 4 generations to manufacture water wheels and turbines, among other things. My first job was uploading a freight car of 100-pound bags at a time. Oh, of lime for the furnace. Yeah. Oh, the founder of the company, Mr. Rodney Hunt, was sued by the Francis Turbine Company for patent infringement. Interesting. There's a lot of really cool stories in historic societies about some of these old technologies. There's sort of a similar story. There's in New York, a company, Archives, which was responsible for producing the biggest wind turbine, not just a windmill for mechanical energy, but a wind turbine for electricity. And so this is really interesting, and company archives, as Mr. Harris points out, is really fruitful for that energy history, for sure.
Well,
And get into the material culture of the power generation.
You did a wonderful presentation, Leah. Was really informative.
Well, good. Hopefully just a little bit inspiring and not too intimidating. Yeah. The idea is like you can kind of tell multiple stories with all different kinds of things.
Demystified it quite a bit now.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, for historic sites to be able to interpret what they have in a meaningful and, current way.
And the book not only has these different case studies, but it also just has these very concise, very non-scientific overviews of the history of these different energy sources, so that, for novices and people who aren't scientists or inclined. But then there's also a lot of, and this is by no means comprehensive because I already know how much I left out, but a bibliography of really good resources for understanding energy that aren't too technical and really pretty accessible if you're into one specific type.
Will there be more projects for you on this topic?
Yeah, actually, so my next book is co-edited, is going to be on trees, but because of this book, the Park Stewardship Forum, which was formerly the George Wright Forum, which is a journal that talks about parks and stewardship of parks, and has been kind of a leader in climate, talking about climate change and environmental stewardship in the parks. They asked me to edit an issue about energy in the parks. So I'm getting together a few contributors who have been thinking about a lot of these same things and kind of fill in the gaps of some of and also build upon some of the ideas in the book, because there's people that have gone a lot further than me in terms of thinking about some of these things, particularly for specific sites. There's one young woman who's talking about like reinterpreting one of the mansions in Rhode Island because they were a coal baron, and really trying to get the climate change story into that interpretation as well. Things like that.
Yeah, excellent.
Mhm.
To follow along and keep posted on all of these developments. And if anyone else had any questions, it's a quiet group today.
Yeah, just overwhelmed everybody. Yeah, the Eric Sloan Museum is a really cool, and also because the Kent Furnace is there is a really interesting site that I'm just gonna cheerlead for in terms of thinking about energy, because then there's a it's next to another site that has all of these different machines and implements. So between like the entire site and with this neighboring like private historic collection of machines and such, you can get a lot of energy history just from that one place.
And there's the mining museum too, to talk about mining fossil fuels.
Yeah. There are all these coal like towns in like Pennsylvania also that you talk about, not just the energy itself, but the culture that was developed in these communities around the mines and around the production of fossil fuels. And that's one of the reasons that it's so ingrained in how we do things, is how much fossil fuels have been tied up with cultural values and ways of life and economic stability, rather than this is just the way it's done and this is the best way to do it. It's not necessarily the best way, and it's not necessarily the only way. It's just the way we've been doing it, and it's gotten into all these other parts of our society. And again, I think that historic sites are some of the best places to explain this and let people explore those ideas.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Leah.
Thank you, guys.
And thank you everyone for attending today. And please grab a copy of Leah's book.
Mm-hmm.
And you can also share this recording. It'll be on Preservation Connecticut's YouTube channel shortly. And we were so glad to have you today, Leah. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.